Well, hello everyone. I'm Brent Eastwood of our Street Institute. I'd like to welcome you to our virtual panel on online content moderation. Today we'll be speaking to actual content moderators who have served in the wild, manning the trenches to keep social media networks safe and free from harmful content. You'll be hearing from two people today who stood at the forefront of content moderation for Meta, and one tech startup founder devoted to policing news articles for misinformation and disinformation. They'll be sharing their experiences, both good and bad, when manning the front lines to fight against misinformation and disinformation while keeping principles of free speech intact. We'll be hearing about elections, horror stories and triumphs, threats to democracy, how to fight racism and other hate speech, free market solutions, recommendations to policymakers, and other aspects of content moderation. We plan on going for an hour with room for questions and answers towards the last 10 minutes of the program. So save those questions until the end and use the Q&A function. Now, let me introduce our panelists for today. First, Katie Harbath. She's the Global Affairs Officer for Duco, an expert network. Well, she'll be leading consulting efforts with technology clients around the world. She was formerly CEO of Anchor Change, a technology consulting firm. Katie was the Director of Technology and Democracy for the International Republican Institute and was also a fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center, the Integrity Institute, and formerly a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. Previously, Katie spent 10 years at Meta. As a director of public policy, she built and led global teams that managed elections and helped government and political figures use the social network to connect with their constituents. Next, we have David Inserra, who is a fellow for free expression and technology at the Cato Institute. His research focuses on the importance of policies and a culture that promotes free expression in the technology space. David's work covers topics including online content policies and moderation, and the harmful impacts of censorship on individuals, companies, technology, and society. David comes to Cato following 4 years on Meta's content policy teams, where he was responsible for crafting and enforcing Meta's community standards, focusing on hate speech, violent speech, restricted goods and services, and support to Meta's oversight board. Next, we have John Pettus, who is a native of San Francisco and a lifelong news junkie. You can see the background of his avatar there. After college and 30 days before 9/11, he enlisted in the Army and built the first civil information management system during his first tour in Iraq. After working in private equity and after leaving the Army as a captain, John designed and founded a startup called Fiskkit to raise the level of discussion online and create accountability for our civic leaders. So that's everybody, and we'll go now to questions for our panelists. And I'd like to start with one for everyone. Can you all describe your job description and role when you administered content moderation, or what you're currently doing for content moderation? What was your average day like on the front lines? And Katie, would you like to start with that?
Yeah, it's kind of an impossible question because it really depended on a day-to-day basis. So my role evolved a lot over the 10 years at Meta. It started with helping politicians and governments just know how to use the platform. And by the end, I was very focused on election integrity type of issues. But towards the end, I would say, we were tracking elections around the globe. So part of my days were looking ahead a year and a half to 2 years of what elections might be happening, what the risks might be around that, but also dealing with day-to-day fires for any elections that would be happening in the moment. So we just, right now, Taiwan just happened on Sunday. We just had the Iowa caucuses, New Hampshire's coming up. You have other global elections. So there would be issues that are going to be popping up on a daily basis, whether it's user reports, people, trusted partners calling you with questions or things that they're seeing on the platform. We might be writing policies. You're seeing right now with a lot of the OpenAI and others, they're having to write new policies around the AI use in this. And so back in my day, I would be doing stuff like that around like political ad transparency, that we were writing those policies for, or helping the teams who are thinking about foreign interference, or how do you think about, working with fact checkers and stuff like that. So it's really hard to describe a typical day because you were really kind of balancing a lot of different things that might be happening. And in a lot of my work, what I'm doing now is helping companies to continue to write those policies, execute on them, understand the risks that they might face, not just here in the United States, but around the globe.
Great. David, you want to try that one?
Yeah, glad to. Yeah, so I had a sort of two hats, I would say, on my team. Generally speaking, the people on the content policy team were both first responsible for developing the policy. So my team undertook the process of doing policy developments where we talked to internal experts, external experts, gathered data from our internal systems, looking at what kind of content was on the platform, and doing that to revise and change the community standards for Facebook and Instagram, as well as another hat, which was the more enforcement hat. My team was responsible for being on call. We managed a 24/7 on-call system where someone from my team was always on call to handle those cases that were high profile, had significant disagreements about how the policy should be interpreted or applied. And my team would be responsible for taking input from oftentimes people like Katie's team and people from other teams, and saying, what do we know about this content? What do we know about the context that's being posted in? And then trying to apply the policies. And like I said, always handling high profile, difficult content that was coming to us. And if it couldn't be handled by us, or if we couldn't make a final decision, it was after us, it was going up the chain to company leadership to make the final call. So that was sort of the two hats, both developers of the policy, but also sort of the ultimate enforcers of the policy.
Thanks to John, you're doing it on a daily basis now.
Yeah. So as a founder and CEO of a startup, our concept at Fiskkit really has been from the very beginning to make content moderation really endogenous to the entire system. And that is kind of one of the differentiating factors. And I think it's something important that everyone who's working in public discourse or platforms now needs to be doing and thinking. There's a more formalized bunch of what are now called trust and safety tools and procedures that are getting a little bit more standardized or well known, that a lot of people are bolting in. But what I do most days is think about how to design our system completely differently in order to incorporate concepts like manipulation or misinformation. Just a top-down level really quick. Fiskkit is based on an old blogging technique called fisking, which popularized by Andrew Sullivan back in the early 2000s when I read it when I was in Iraq and a bunch of other places. And it's essentially the concept of, instead of replying to an entire article, you go through and you reply to individual points within the article. And we use that and combine it with some math to hopefully generate, crowdsource, statistically reliable fact checks of eventually all online news in essentially real time. And so our entire system is based around analytics and looking through what people are saying and assessing them for facts, logic, and civility. So we're constantly thinking about ways that we can design the system and the interaction for public discourse for these goals that we're looking at. So we're much earlier on, obviously, than Facebook or Meta, and but that also gives us the ability to pivot and think and make early downstream decisions that will make hopefully our lives easier when we scale up later in the path.
Great, thanks. Next question for everyone. On a positive note, let's start positively. What were your highlights of content moderation? So what accomplishments are you most proud of during your past or current career on combating misinformation and disinformation? David, would you like to start on that one?
Yeah, sure. So just one example that I'll provide is of there were two cases that were sent to me when I was on call one time from different regions of the world, and essentially in one case I was being asked to essentially restore a piece of content because it was from a known satirical organization. Our internal teams were telling us like this is a very known satirical organization. You can see by the post it's satire. This should be allowed on the platform. On the other hand, I was also I was receiving a simultaneous request from a different region where I was seeing content from another high profile user, and I was being asked, well, this clearly violates our policies. Just want to confirm that we should take this down. And I remember saying, well, I know this user. That would seem very strange. Like, this is a high profile user. I know about them. Let me look at the content. Sure enough, their content was actually quite satirical in nature as well. So seeing two sort of satirical pieces of content where I'm being asked by the different teams to make different decisions. So one of the things I like to highlight is the fact that I was always very proud of was the fact that when on call, looking for that sense of like, you need to understand the content from like a variety of different perspectives to understand how it should be interpreted and to make sure you're applying your rules equitably and fairly to all. Because I think that's a common accusation that you see in the big tech space. And so one of the things I always focused on was trying to get the application of policies fairly and equitably. And that little example is one that I was always very proud of, even though it was quite small, but it's just an example of something I was always proud of.
Thanks. Katie, any highlights?
Yeah, I think there's so many. Two that I'd point out, though. One, I'm just really proud of the political ad transparency stuff that we built. It's something that it was industry leading, continues to be. We don't see many other platforms doing that and putting the amount of resources into that. And so what that team did in the beginning and continues to do is something I'm really proud of. And second of all is the amount of money and resources that Meta put into all of this. I, again, am coming at this very much from an elections perspective, but it is a very much broader integrity content moderation perspective. And for a very long time, they've put a lot of effort into building tools around this, really thinking about these policies, trying to have a nuanced perspective and continuing to improve. We can easily debate about if we agree with the decisions that they've made and where they are putting all those investments. But I think when you compare it up against many other tech companies, they have put a lot into that. And I think that has really impacted the industry as newer platforms have been trying to take some of the lessons learned from that.
Great. John, what are you most proud of?
I would say just having the opportunity and thinking from the beginning to design a system with incentives that match pro-social ethics. I think one of the big problems, and we'll probably touch on it a few times today, in general, is the attention economy, which I think is somewhat inherently pernicious and grabby and kind of annoying and only going to get more so. And that's because we're farming people's attention and selling it for money. And we're all feeling that. And that doesn't always align with what's best for us or even the platforms or society in general. And so, designing a system that specifically allows people to police personal attacks, off-topic comments. We even have a feature we added where one commenter gets to point out as a tag, a green tag, oh, that person made a concession. And it's coded green because it's a compliment. It's right there with insightful, well-researched, because it says, hey, good for this person. They conceded a point, because that's who you want to talk to, someone you can talk to. And so designing systems with kind of pro-social incentives like that is something that I'm very proud of, and I think is going to be an exciting space going forward.
Thanks. That's excellent. I'm sure you have a lot of happy users. Okay, now on the flip side of that, for everyone, on a negative note, What are your biggest horror stories? These are situations where you saw horrible and awful things and maybe were not able to stop them from being posted. David, would you like to start us off with that?
Sure, yeah. I can pretty confidently say that I think one of the most difficult periods of time that I saw was in 2021, prior to the current conflict in Israel and Palestine. There was a smaller incident in 2021 between Israel and Palestine, and that was just an incredibly hard period. I remember on me and on our team, similar issues of terrorism, violence, graphic content. This is also in the middle of COVID, so there's accusations of people being viruses and all these things coming together. That was a particularly difficult period. And I have to say, as soon as the most recent conflict broke out, I did think about like how my current colleagues are handling that situation, because you see really difficult content, human rights issues, important content mixed with really, really ugly bad stuff. And it's a hard place to be. So that was one of the hardest points in my time.
Katie, any bad stories you want to share?
I'm trying to figure out where to start. But I think that I would say the period after the 2016 election, from the not even just November, but I would say for me, it all kind of started going back to May 9th, 2016, which was the day of the Philippines election, as well as the day that a controversy broke about Facebook's trending topics section and a contractor accusing the company of suppressing conservative content. You had Brexit a month later. You then had the US election. And then after that, like what I can just remember is like one of the times where it's just you have this feeling in the pit of your stomach is realizing things that have been happening on the platform that you hadn't caught. So it's not like you can go back and try to fix it at all. Now you're trying to think about, you're just, oh my God, how did I miss it? And how do we try to prevent it going on in the future? And then it started with Macedonian teenagers spreading fake news to make money. Then it was the Russian Internet Research Agency ads. Then you had Cambridge Analytica. So there was just a lot of waves of trying to keep up with that and kind of grapple with all of those things that are happening, and trying to, you can't stop the world from turning, you can't stop elections from happening. How do you try to then the really difficult things are, you know how many things you want to do, you know the things you want to build, you can't do it all at once. It is not a flip of a switch that you can just make it happen. So the hardest things are knowing that there's more that you should be doing, but you just physically can't do it. And then I would say another horror story is also just realizing how hard it can be to detect some of these things. I think back to the Christchurch massacre that happened and the struggle of the platforms to try to find copies of that video to try to enforce that. I'm thinking now about how difficult it is for detecting AI and some of these videos and stuff like that. And there's just always going to be things that get through. And again, you're trying to do your best you're trying to do your best. And I would have to say for those inside the company, and I think I see David kind of shaking his head yes to this as well, we're as hard as ourselves as everybody is externally as well, of trying to figure these things out and get them right. And there's no agreement. We're getting it from all sides. And so when you have that built up over time, all of those things can get really difficult. So I'm not asking for, an oh woe is us who is in tech on any of it, but it's not something where people are oblivious inside the companies to these challenges and feeling the responsibility of what they have to do.
Yeah, thanks for that. How about you, John? Any egregious articles that you want to share with the group?
So actually, I fortunately don't have any major horror stories. Our public version is still mostly in beta. Most of our early reps have been in our systems, also used in schools to train critical thinking, because it's a very easy way for teachers to run students through arguments and quickly flag, fact, opinion, unsupported claim, strawman argument. So getting them lots of reps really quick is another way, and that is way we're trying to get ourselves out of the trap of monetizing attention by selling a product for money to schools. But that also comes with a pretty good set of moderators that are already incentivized in the teachers in the classroom. So fortunately, we haven't had any big blowups on the public side yet, but it's only a matter of time. And I have so much sympathy for these two, because it is inevitable that you will get criticized, and it is inevitable that you will not be able to catch everything. And it is frustrating often to hear public commenters and public policy leaders not really understand how it works and think, well, just take all that stuff off. It's like, it's not that easy, man. You're trying to get computers to recognize content, which is not a solved problem yet.
Definitely. Let's switch gears a little bit and put on your recommendation hat. For all of you, if you could speak to some social media CEOs, what would be your advice for improving content moderation? How can we do better? And what would you say to leaders of these companies? David, you want to tackle that, or anybody can jump in?
I'm happy to start. Yeah. I mean, I would have two related pieces of advice. The first would be that I think that there's been a lot of focus on, I think, the harms of potential bad content in the social media space. But the core product that they're developing is expression. And so thinking about how free expression may need a better advocate inside companies, because I think you have a lot of folks who are genuinely looking for bad stuff, right? Like, we're being criticized for not finding that stuff, not taking it down. It's like, but we're trying to give people ability to express themselves. And so creating advocates for expression within your companies, that way it's not just a system that is dedicated to just safety, but also expression. An example I like to use is that there's, it's like free expression is like in a trial. It's like, it's innocent until proven guilty. That's great. We want free expression, but you need a defense attorney because there's a lot of people criticizing you for not taking down enough stuff. A lot of prosecutors, a lot of hostile witnesses. So these companies have access to a lot of information, a lot of stuff. They could be great advocates and researchers of free expression. I would love for them to jump into that. Related point is, maybe social media companies don't need to also solve every single difficult social problem. Every single time there's a new issue, we need a new policy to stop the bad thing, but people disagree about what is harmful, what is not. Maybe we could give more control to users to help them determine what is harmful to them and what's not harmful to them. Just a thought that, yeah, maybe we don't have to put ourselves sort of on the hook for every single big problem in the world, and focus on those truly harmful things while leaving more control to users.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, I can jump in too. I think I want to plus one to what David said, and also add in, I think that there's a lot more that these companies can do to provide transparency into their decision making and the trade-offs that they're having to counter with this. I have a podcast that I call Impossible Trade-offs, because it really is. I know sometimes when I'll go to external groups and stuff, I'm like, okay, I'm going to put you in my shoes. You have to choose. One of the hardest ones is choosing like employee safety on the ground in some of these countries and doing what the government wants you to do, which is really hard for an American or anybody in the Western world to kind of get their head wrapped around that would even be a trade-off. And oftentimes people are like, oh, no, I don't know. I don't want to have to make that choice. That's really hard. And it's like, yes, that's sort of a day-to-day thing. And so having a bit more transparency from the companies of what those trade-offs are, the values that they are weighing in making those sort of trade-offs, when they might be reevaluating those decisions, I think will help people to, even if they don't agree with the decision that the company makes, at least understands how they got there, and why they did what they did. I also think too that one of the biggest mistakes that the companies made early on in all of this was being too confident in our ability to enforce these policies. There was a of like, it's going to be perfect. And everybody on here has been like, it's not going to be perfect. You're going to get criticized. And I think that there was a little too much in the beginning of making that expectation that people couldn't follow. And so then you end up with these stories and stuff that happen. The last thing I'll just say is continue to be really disciplined on separating out the signal from the noise. It can be very tempting to just follow and be very reactive to whatever reports are coming out, what others are seeing. And you should pay attention to those, but it shouldn't be the only thing that you do. I kind of go back to my campaign days, right? Where a losing campaign is one that's just reacting to the questions that reporters are asking or that others want you to talk about versus making sure you're getting your own message out there too. So finding that right balance is really hard and is only something that you inside of the company can be understanding if you think you're finding that balance correctly.
John, you would probably just say use our software, right?
Well, that's one strongly recommended. But I would echo a lot of what Katie said. A lot of it is mostly going to be communication, like life. The fundamental issue here is that ultimately some human being has to make a call and draw a line. And this is something that people don't realize. They're like, oh, I'll just have some programmatic or systematic system that'll do this all for me. Or, like Elon Musk was like, well, obviously I'll cut off everything that's illegal and everything else is good to go. And that's just so naive about the very concept of how public discourse works. Some human has to make a call and somebody has to draw a line. Now, where we draw the line, and this is a fact of public discourse, will inevitably be in different places, which means the best thing for you is to communicate early and clearly, and then continuously, right? Katie touched on this, but it's important to bring back, because this will be a constant theme, is that there has been a presumption of omniscience on the part of platforms and then omnipotence to do something about it. And neither of those things is true. Even if you literally have all the levers in the code, you still can't see what all of humanity is saying at all times, because you got to write code, and code doesn't understand innuendo, nuance, code switching, all these things. Like oftentimes, and David made this point, a lot of the problems are humans doing the problems humans have always done, just running it through a new medium, right? And so asking the medium to suddenly solve all this bad human behavior is not necessarily a realistic thing. And then as a platformer, and this is true in this domain space as in all others, is we live in a world of constant information warfare. And so unlike David's analogy of you needed a defense attorney, an advocate, that would be great in a classroom, but there's no rules, there's no law here. The communication is part of a PR strategy in an environment of information warfare with bad faith actors who are going to lie, cheat, and steal. So that is what these platforms have coming at them. So just being like, well, we were right and we applied the rules, isn't how they're approaching things. They're executing defensive PR and defensive information warfare strategies because they're taking incoming constantly. So that's a lot.
I'm going to ask you to keep your recommendation hats on, and we're going to shift over to tech policy and a little bit of politics. For all of you, if you could advise legislators and policymakers, what would you say to improve content moderation for social media platforms? We're getting more and more legislation out there, good, bad, and ugly. And have you seen anything that you agree with or disagree with on the policy front? And how would you talk to policymakers about some of these solutions that are coming from the government side?
I think.
I will. Sorry,
Go ahead, John. Go ahead.
So I was just gonna follow up because I was recently came back from DC where a startup advocacy group flew a bunch of us out there to go talk to legislators. So I've done this relatively recently, and I'll jump right into the deep end of the pool and say, do not mess with Section 213 or 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which is obviously controversial, but for me, it is kind of the First Amendment of the tech space. And there's a very important principle that you don't want to nibble away at the edges of because, and this is my philosophy, and I think it should be everyone's, you really don't want the government deciding what people can read and write. And as soon as you get into that business at all, you're in bad space. Like I said, some human has to make a call and draw a line, and it's true of government policy also, and I don't want them to do that. I don't think they're competent. I don't think they'll do it honestly or in my interest, and so I think they should not do it at all. We're talking about private spaces, so it's not technically a free speech issue. So let bad platforms make bad decisions, and people can leave them, as they have been doing a lot, maybe this year more than most. And so let the free market kind of, and I'm not a free market absolutist at all. I'm a very nuanced thinker about these things, but this is a case where you just don't want the government to try to make these judgment calls. They won't do a good job, is my piece.
What I was going to jump in with is one, I think we need to move away from this being content-based. I think that, especially here, just doing this from a US perspective, I just think the First Amendment's it's not gonna allow it. It's gonna maybe work its way through courts, but and we'll see how the Supreme Court rules in 3 kind of really important cases this year on that. And so I suspect that we should see, and I would like this conversation to keep moving in the direction of more transparency from these platforms so we can better understand what is happening on them and how our information ecosystem, how they interact with one another. We need to stop thinking about these platforms as silos. They're not. That's not how this works. We all use a bunch of different platforms, and you need to be able to have external folks who can be monitoring that and just for an understanding of our information ecosystem, not necessarily to control it, but to have an understanding and thinking about what counter messaging and other things that need to be done to be pushed out there, which could also mean funding for organizations and help for people from media literacy to doing that type of stuff and thinking about that. Then there's also kind of looking at the behavior of folks that are on these platforms. You can maybe look a little bit at the design, though in all honesty, that makes me a little uncomfortable as well. There's also disclosure. So there's another form of transparency. A lot of companies are saying that, AI ads in politics are going to have to be labeled as AI. Now, labels have their own pros and cons, and, none of these are silver bullets of what they work, but those are the types of solutions I would like to see us debating and thinking about as we're going into this versus trying to, as John said, try to draw any particular lines of what people can or cannot say, because that is a slippery slope I do not want to go down in this country.
Yeah, I mean, easy to +1 the idea that there's going to be significant unintended consequences if you get the government involved in trying to moderate content in both directions, whether it's Florida, Texas style laws, which are currently before the courts in the net choice cases, or you have provisions like New York's hate speech requirement, like transparency law, where you have to post a hate speech law, which is also in the courts. And so whether it's whatever issue you care about and you want the government to get involved, the other side wants the other thing. And the idea that we would have the government getting involved in trying to meddle with content moderation decisions, it's not workable, it's unfeasible, and it's going to have dramatic negative unintended consequences. I think the thing that lawmakers could do is think about attacking these companies. Think about trying to defend them in ways. For instance, you do have cases. Another Supreme Court case is the Murphy v. Missouri case. It's the case of the government allegedly trying to pressure companies into censoring content. And we have there's some emails train indicating there is a pressure that is working in some cases. We should probably try to stop that pressuring of companies to remove content of its users, because that's abridging the rights of these companies to speak as they wish and to allow their property to work as they wish. And so I think greater transparency about what the government is demanding of companies would be a great step forward, a transparency-based approach on that. And then similarly, thinking about what the EU is doing. There's a lot of requirements coming out of the EU with the Digital Service Act and whatnot. These are all burdens and requirements that are being added to US companies, because the EU doesn't have many of these companies, because they don't have the innovation that we do. So how can we actually maybe support and defend US companies against assaults from regulation and barriers to trade and whatnot that are coming from abroad? That's an area where maybe legislators could take another look.
Just a quick follow-up on that. I think that the EU point is a really good one, and it's very frustrating, I think, to everybody who works in tech, the idea that any legislature on planet Earth thinks they're going to write the laws that govern the internet. Like, really? You in Montenegro are going to write the rules of how the internet works. That doesn't even make sense, as the Spanish legislature found out when they tried to pass a tax on Google links to their newspapers, and the newspapers almost all went out of business. They had to call a special session of the legislature to repeal that tax before all their newspapers went out of business. Just arguing against my own interest, because that's what I do as a discourse fetishist. There are really gnarly edge cases here, which will be used as the wedge to try to push for government intervention. Always, and this is historically for 100 years, long before the internet, the wedge cases protect the children, right? And this has always been the case. We have to interfere with people's rights and their freedoms, because otherwise they'll use it to do terrible things to children. And this is certainly the leading case. I think, Katie, some of the Supreme Court cases are around these laws passed to protect children. I think there's, I forget what.
There's a few working its way through the courts, not at the Supreme Court yet, specifically on kids, but there's definitely like age verification laws and stuff like that that's working its way through the court system.
And that's tough. And it actually runs parallel to encryption, which isn't inherent in this discussion, but it is actually very closely related. Can the government say you can't have encrypted communication that we can't break into and look at the content of, because you're going to use it for, child trafficking or drugs or terrorism or something like that? And so these are kind of social policies that there are arguments on the other side. But for the most part, I think you need to like David said, you need to very much land on the side of caution and innocent until proven guilty, and a presumption of not letting the government get its fat fingers into controlling what people see and write.
Thanks for that. David, you're a part of that 24-hour rapid response team. What type of people were you working with in terms of their talents? I mean, how do you find somebody who is a good content moderator? What are those qualities, and what would you look for if you had to lead that team again, or be a part of that team again, and maybe be a leader?
Yeah. So, I mean, for my team, it was really folks who could think quickly to understand and apply policy, as well as having a mindset that was open to alternative perspectives. We had many disagreements about gray areas or differences in the policy. And some of these disagreements were more worldview based or ideologically based, but many times they were parsing rules in a rather arcane sort of legalistic way, like a textualist judge saying, well, this word means X, not Y. And another person saying, but the policy was meant to cover that. And we didn't include that example because it's falling under this section of the policy. It's like, you're having these discussions and you're trying to basically think through these things on often short timelines and trying to come to some sort of consensus with other people who are also trying to engage in that same sort of critical thinking about how these policies apply to difficult pieces of content. So it's that sort of mindset of critical thinking, quickly thinking on your feet, being able to communicate that in a fast manner, and then working with grace with your colleagues who are also doing the exact same thing you're doing. Often, like I said, having sometimes ideological, sometimes just reading the differences of how you read the content, and trying to then take that all in and come to a position where you say, I see your point, you see my point, and we're trying to then apply the policy fairly because of all that input and thinking that we've done.
Anybody else? How do you recruit? What makes a good content moderator?
I mean, there's a lot of different types of jobs that have to do with content moderation, but I think again, plus one everything David said. I think it's also important to have somebody who understands thinking about these things different for different cultures around the world, and making sure, really understanding where their blind spots might be, and biases in this. But you also need folks that they're very comfortable working in uncomfortable situations, in chaotic situations where you're not going to have all the information you want to have. You have to make a decision quickly. You have to be willing to iterate on that decision or stuff like that. But you're really making decision making in an imperfect, you don't have time. I love to do this with college students where I make them be content moderators, and I start with the easy stuff. And then I go to the more borderline content and some of the examples that John was giving, and they'll be like, do we have time to research this? Can we try to figure out more about their intent? And I'm like, nope, you got 30 seconds. Figure it out. And it's not always that fast, but I think that, it is, I always say people that work in trust and safety and content moderation are people that run into a fire. They run into a fire. They're comfortable with being in those types of roles and positions, and it's not for everyone, and that's okay. But one of the things I just love the most about this work is these are the hardest problems, and you're working on them with really, really smart people, and there aren't easy solutions. And some of my best days at Meta were some of the toughest as well, of really trying to debate and figure out the right way forward, and really learning from your colleagues of trying to find, as David said, the right way forward.
So I just want to highlight on that. One of the things that Katie's talking about is something that we don't talk about enough, I think, which is moral reasoning. It's left out of the big communications. We do a lot of logos and pathos and not a lot of ethos, and it's very rewarding and fulfilling and difficult, especially because we don't really teach moral reasoning anymore. But that's super, super duper important. I don't have as many war stories. I'm the only real content moderator that we have on our side. But I think about this, and I've certainly spent a lot of time with folks in the industry. And I think that one thing that has come up in the last couple of years, which is important to note, is that is the kind of care and feeding and maintenance and support for the people who work in trust and safety is something that we've become newly aware of, especially the psychological damage that can come from processing a lot of like the worst human behavior is brutal, which is why I think not a lot of people can do that job. And so I think that's something that we're learning about more, and I think we'll get better at going forward over time. But you need special people to be able to do that.
Thanks for that. Well, obviously this year, big election year, 2024. Katie, what are you most worried about in terms of misinformation and disinformation for this election year?
Yeah, for those that aren't familiar, what makes 2024 such an unprecedented year is it's the first time ever in history that in the same year as a US presidential, you've also got elections in places like India, Indonesia, maybe Ukraine, Taiwan, Mexico, the United Kingdom, European Parliament. There's a lot of different numbers out there depending on how people count elections. I've got an explainer on my Substack if folks are interested. But it is, according to The Economist, over 4 billion people could be impacted by elections this year. So that's a lot of fronts for people to fight and protect election integrity on their platform. So even this year was going to be a struggle for even the most well-resourced of teams. Some of these teams have been hit by trust and safety, or been hit by layoffs, not trust and safety. They've been hit by trust and safety teams have been hit by layoffs. Sorry. You also have a lot of newer platforms that are trying to figure this out for the first time. And they don't have the tools necessarily that a Meta and Google have built up. They're building these policies for the first time. So I think that's going to be a challenge and something I'm watching. I believe AI is going to be an accelerant on all of this, but I don't. One of my mantras going into this next year is to panic responsibly. Because we are certainly going to have, if you want a t-shirt, you can go to panicresponsibly.com and get one. I made some merch and stickers, but because I'm worried about, we've seen examples of AI being used already. We're going to continue to see that. But I liken this more to Obama using social media in 2008 versus his campaign in 2012. I think AI will have a lot more impacts on campaigns going forward, but there's still going to be a time period of widespread adoption and everything that is going to take some time. So I'm actually most worried about the narrative around AI and making people panic, and being just the narrative and how that's going to impact people's trust on information, and what that could do of people trusting just that their electoral process was done in a free and fair manner, I think is something that is going to be challenging. But we need to be really careful about not just paying attention to the shiny thing, which is AI right now. A lot of this is still going to be good old-fashioned ways that bad actors are going to be trying to just kind of poke and pour gasoline on the chaos that's already happening, the polarization that's already out there. And so we need to be making sure we're kind of looking at this holistically, but it's really hard because there's so many different aspects that are happening are going to play off of one another, that the metaphor I've been using is a kaleidoscope, because it is really hard to predict what things are going to look like this time in 2025, because you have so many different things and variables that might happen. And inevitably, there's going to be stuff that happens that nobody dreamed of, that nobody has a policy on, nobody's quite sure what is going to happen. And it's going to be people that used to be in roles that David and I had that are going to be sitting there being like, we got to figure this out right now. And we may not know the impact of those decisions until well after this year.
Let's talk about another, we've been talking about Meta a lot, another social media platform, Twitter, which makes use of community notes. And do you think that's an adequate system of policing that platform? Why or why not? Anybody ever do a community note?
I've never done a community note. I've actually been fairly impressed with it, actually. It's a lot better than I thought it was going to be. And there are actually a bunch of interesting interactions. Like, I don't know if you guys have seen, but I see a lot of community notes on the ads that get run on Twitter, a lot of which are saying things like, this is a drop shipping thing that is usually scammers, and these people usually don't make this product and it's sent from China. And about half the ads that I see on Twitter are these kind of drop ship little plastic products, and they have community notes attached saying this is probably a scam. And I was like, well, that's certainly anytime I see a mechanic that's running against interest, certainly against financial interest, that gets my attention, because that's not very common. So it's certainly working better than I thought it was, and I've found it usefully calling out misinformation, or recycled photos and videos that are from 2 years ago, or from a video game and not an actual war, which really happens, and stuff like that. So I thought it's been better than I expected, and decent.
Yeah.
Thanks, Brent.
I was going to jump in and say that I also similarly like community notes, because I think about it in the way it sort of is decentralizing sort of the way that we moderate content, rather than it being like me or someone at Meta, or it be a fact checker somewhere. It's the community process is community, and that I think actually helps us get more like at the process of how we actually develop what is true and false, this back and forth, this deliberative process. It reminds me of Jonathan Rauch's way ahead of its time Kindly Inquisitors, where he talks about how as a society we determine what is true, what is good. And he talks about how there's rules of what science, whether that's like actual scientific endeavor or just how we develop truth in public policies. You talk about how there's no final say and no ultimate authority. And I think a lot of the other models that use like fact checkers, for instance, Meta has a fact checking program where the fact checker, if you disagree with them, you have to appeal to that fact checker. They have ultimate authority. So you could have the best evidence, you could be the leading epidemiologist or whatever in your field, and you could write something, and a 25-year-old researcher for that outfit could say, I disagree, and you can't publish this content, we're rating it false or whatever. That so lack
Dave,
of good.
Sorry, Dave, on that point, I think community notes is not structured quite in the way that you're thinking, because community notes sources from a lot of people, but it does actually go through
Sure.
a team of folks, and so there is someone who will give the thumbs up or thumbs down.
Yep.
I was actually in the room 10 years ago when we started the International Fact Checking Network, which is the group that certifies at Meta the fact checkers. And
Yep.
One of the things that has always been true about those folks is that it is a little bit of a guild, as in we are the fact checkers, and you're inside or you're out. And for example, I am outside because our system of trying to fact check at internet scale, they're saying you're not having a journalist do this, therefore you're doing something different. And I'm saying, yeah, I'm doing something that scales to the size of the problem, but so I'm not a certified fact checker according to IFCN, which is very much kind of old school, like have an actual journalist go through. And there are a lot of merits to that system, but scaling to the size of the problem isn't one of them. So
Yeah,
I just want that note on community notes, it's not quite automatic and scalable in the same way.
It's not complete. It's not like just the majority rules and like, yeah, because you could easily abuse it that way. But that's similar, like that still there's a deliberative process of diverse perspectives being heard. And that rather than it being, like I said, one ultimate authority, and yeah, whatever the approved fact checkers are, that has always appealed to me as a way of, this is how we develop what knowledge is because we do have an actual debate rather than one person or organization deciding that they are going to be the arbiters of truth. I think that's just a better way. It more resembles how we actually develop knowledge.
Well, there's a particular problem in the fact checking where, I mean, there are a number of them in the structure of the thing, but one of them is that is talked about by people who study the issue is it's not always that there's a problem with the actual fact checks. It's the decision of what among all the problems, what to fact check, right?
Yes.
And among human fact checkers, and certainly at PolitiFact and organizations like that, they have a concept called the buffet, which is someone has flagged all this stuff, and then they will take their very limited human resources and pick which things to do. And you've introduced a ton of human bias in that. And the thing that community notes and things like Fiskkit, which Fiskkit is actually probably the closest to, because we don't have humans come in. We actually use intelligent math and wisdom of crowds and a bunch of white papers to do exactly what you're saying without going through people, of detecting all of these questionable things, some of which are good and some of which are bad. But detection is a huge problem, right, on the scope of the internet. And so Community Notes has a great ability to detect in all kinds of squirrely corners of the platform where stuff is going on. It just then it funnels, kind of like Wikipedia does, to a group of super users.
Okay, I got one more last one before we go to audience questions. Anybody want to take a crack at this? How do we educate people, especially young people, or really any user, better to help combat misinformation and disinformation? What are some of the things, and John works with students a lot, but what are some of the other things that we can do for education so people can learn how to avoid hate speech, misinformation, disinformation, things like that?
I can jump in here. I think first and foremost, we should not think about this as a particular problem amongst any one generation. I oftentimes, sometimes it's actually older generations that might be more susceptible to this than others. So I want to be careful around kind of thinking about this as it's just a problem that we got to educate young people. I think it's all of society that we need to be working with. The second thing is that, when I talk to a lot of people, a lot of them are like, my God, these problems are so big. I don't work at a tech company. I don't have nobody there. Like, what can I even do? And we all can control our information intake. We can all think about how we are trying to curate our feeds. They take signals from what you're engaging with, what you follow, what you're muting and blocking, to what David was saying was giving users more controls. And a lot of these platforms have, to better understand, so that you can kind of be trying to curate the content that's coming in. The last thing I would say is I encourage everybody to take a moment to think about, when you are consuming content all throughout the day, when there is stuff happening, thinking about trying to find, additional sources, especially when news is breaking. We saw this a lot around the conflict in Israel, that even journalists were having trouble kind of separating out the signal from the noise. So we need to understand that that's going to happen in the beginnings of any sort of event, when everyone's trying to figure out the facts on the ground. And so really trying to think about, and I've been doing this for myself right now, is kind of just doing a little audit of where I'm consuming information, how I'm thinking about finding, backing up stories and things of that nature. And then there is, if you're working for an organization, thinking about how do you get counter messaging out? What are people saying about your organization or your issues? And what can you do to better get also your perspective out there?
Okay, we got a great question from one of our attendees about conflict and war. So let me share that with you. What is the role of media platforms such as Meta in assuring straightforward and transparent information during wartime? Should users rely on social media for honest, albeit graphic, images of war crimes when journalistic agencies refuse to share this information? What do we do during war?
So
Yes.
despite not being a Meta person, I was an Army intelligence officer for 10 years. And let me tell you, you must understand that while the bullets may be going somewhere else, the information warfare is coming to your iPhone. So understand that you are seeing and participating in information warfare. That's actually true whether there are bullets flying somewhere. It's always information warfare. But we must keep this in mind. Do not be naive when you walk into the information environment. People have agendas. People are manipulating. Not everything is honest. So just understand that that is true, has always been true. And then I'll let the experts talk about the platform side.
No, I think that's a great sort of preface, which is that because when we were seeing this kind of content on the platforms, there is this constant struggle between almost like the journalistic ethics of like we thought about them ourselves, like well newspapers won't publish this, that's their editorial standard, it's a widely accepted editorial standard, should we adopt that standard, should we have a different standard? Like these are the kind of considerations that we have to think through. On top of that, you have bad actors who are using it might be a fake photo, it might be just an altered photo, it might be just an old photo, the person might not even know that it's old or altered or whatever. So all those challenges go into how much should we rely. And so what Katie mentioned before about being sort of taking everything with a grain of salt, critically looking at what you're taking in. I do think social media can serve that role of giving you more information than maybe the traditional media could give you. That's the great thing. It's great. It's crowdsourced. You can get that, but that comes with the responsibility on the user to think critically and with a grain of salt about what they're partaking in. From our side, that just meant that there were situations where, like I said, we were making, even if it technically violated the policy, we were making what we would call newsworthy allowances. This is content that it's clearly graphic, it's clearly disturbing, but there's an important right for the public to know about the crimes that are being committed, the bad things that are happening, especially when we have a good sense of the fact that, yeah, this is true. This is actually a picture of Bucha in Ukraine. This is actually a picture coming out of what's happening in Israel and Palestine. Right? Like those are the sorts of places where it might violate the policies, but our team was thinking about, we should probably err on the side of allowing this because it's important that people know. And we can use things like warning screens and interstitials to tell people that this is graphic, so they're not just scrolling through Facebook and all of a sudden like murdered people are right in front of them, but they can access it if they want to, because that's very important. So yeah, it's a constant tension between all these different factors.
Here's a good one from our audience. Content moderators are often criticized for having political bias. So especially in election year, how do we effectively avoid bias when moderating content from team members?
I mean, Dave, do you want to go first, or I can?
Sure. So I think it's important to distinguish two things. And first is the difference between the content policies and then also the content moderation. Content moderation is being done by like lots of people, but also just machines that are just, they've learned enough cycles, they've learned what violates, what not, and they're just applying the algorithm at scale. And then you've got reviewers as well who are called in this, to support that as well. And some companies might use almost all algorithms, some might use more people. It just depends on the company. And so the bias there is, I don't really think of, so there can be bias there, but that's not, I don't think, usually the problem that we're thinking about. It's usually and this is where the challenge probably lies, that you probably have a more substantial disagreement with the policy itself. Like the policy was developed, it said, we're not going to allow manifestos of mass shooters. Okay, we don't allow manifestos of mass shooters. Then, mass shooter comes along that you want to talk about why they were doing their mass shooting. And, the social media companies take down that content. You say, oh, they're taking it down because of the narrative, whatever. Well, they just don't allow mass shooter manifestos, period. It's not necessarily a bias. Now, like I said, you could take issue with, well, maybe they should have allowed that content. Maybe there's an issue of limiting public access to public events and discussing things that are going on. Maybe that you take issue with the policy. But more rare, I think, is the true case of actual bias. But that's actually where people like my team, like I said, that's why my first example about trying to apply laws equally was what literally policies equally was one of my greatest focuses when I was on call, because it is a challenge, because people don't come to these decisions without their priors. And so it's a very important point, but usually I just want to make that distinction between policies and moderation.
If I can make two additional points onto that. One is that it's really important to have to understand those biases. And one of the things I know a lot of companies do is training for their employees on understanding what your unconscious biases might be. Um, and it's just recognizing those, like, who might you need to pull in? Like, for instance, I'm a hunter. I got pulled in on a lot of conversations about gun policy at Meta to try to figure out that difference between what might be acceptable in a hunting perspective versus other perspectives. And I was brought in because I had that experience, and others were like, we have no idea about that culture, how that works, or what that looks like, so that we can have that balance. The second thing I just want to assure anybody listening to this, there are not rooms full of people being like looking purposely for conservative, liberal, any type of political content to be like, I just want to make sure to take them down. I promise you, it's not happening. I know it can be easy to think it is. Sometimes these things are just bugs. Sometimes, a lot of times, it's what David said. It's a disagreement with the policy and where they're drawing the line. And that's where I would like to have these debates happen about where those lines should be drawn versus where I think they are today.
My macro point, because I don't have a room full of mainframes running teams and algorithms and all that stuff, is that in the broader information environment, remember, there will always be accusations of bias. That will never, ever stop. We will never live in a world where everyone doesn't accuse any gatekeeper or person of bias, and it cannot be disproven. And from what we're learning about psychology is fellow tribes people will take that accusation and run with it. And we are in a down cycle of decreasing trust in society that can go only so low, which terribly, I think we are going to explore the bottom depths of trust in society. But just remember, for the rest of our lives, there will be large groups of coordinated people claiming whoever you're talking about is operating in bad faith and trying to pull one over on you. And that will never end. And so the trick is, can we sort valid claims from invalid, rigorous from non-rigorous claims? And like David was saying, a lot of that relies on your ability to do good critical thinking, which is a long-term problem that we are trying to work on.
Okay, great, everyone. We are past the top of the hour, unfortunately. I apologize for not getting to all the audience questions. There are many good ones, but I hope you learned something and heard something that will really make you think about this year and the way you use social media, especially during election time. And we really want to thank our panelists for today. And if we were in person, we'd be doing a round of applause, but that's as good as I can do it right now. But this is the second in a series of online content moderation panels. I'll probably do another one as we get closer to the election. So I want to thank you, and thank you for all of our attendees for staying with us, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks all.
Thank you.